Oh God, I hate this.
Oh look, it's going everywhere. Hang on. So nobody got shot.
Where is that?
Oh look, it's everywhere.
Oh, there it is. Bloody thing.
Something about the atmosphere felt different long before anyone spoke about a controversy. What appeared at first glance to be a routine royal gathering soon became the center of a much larger conversation, one that touched on loyalty, legacy, and an uncomfortable question that continues to divide royal watchers even now. What happens when the symbols of a monarchy become part of a struggle over its future? Inside the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, where tradition is often communicated through gestures as much as words, attention was initially focused on the familiar rhythms of royal life. Guests exchanged greetings beneath glittering chandeliers, senior figures moved through the room with practiced ease, and the atmosphere carried the quiet confidence that accompanies events shaped by centuries of protocol. Yet amid all that ceremony stood an object that many considered far more than furniture. To those who had served during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, it represented continuity itself, a visible reminder of a monarch whose influence had defined an era. That is where the story truly begins. For years, observers of the royal family have noted that the transition from one reign to another is never simply administrative. While crowns, titles, and responsibilities may transfer according to established rules, public affection and historical legitimacy are far more difficult to inherit. This reality has followed King Charles III since the moment he ascended the throne, and it has inevitably shaped perceptions of Queen Camilla as well. The question was never merely whether a new chapter had begun. The deeper question was whether the new chapter would be accepted as naturally connected to the one that came before it. According to accounts that later circulated among royal commentators, one moment during the gathering unexpectedly drew attention away from every conversation taking place in the room. What happened appeared minor to some observers, yet deeply symbolic to others. And symbolism, as history repeatedly demonstrates, often carries extraordinary weight within royal institutions. What made the situation particularly sensitive was not simply who was involved, but who noticed it. Princess, and the Princess Royal, has long occupied a unique position within the monarchy. Unlike many public figures whose influence depends upon headlines or publicity, Anne's reputation has been built through decades of consistency, duty, and an unwavering commitment to royal tradition. Even critics of the institution frequently acknowledge her reputation for discipline and directness. When she reacts strongly to something, people tend to assume there is a reason. That assumption quickly became central to the unfolding drama. Reports suggest that Anne's attention became fixed on an interaction involving a highly symbolic element associated with the late Queen's legacy. Witnesses later described an atmosphere that seemed to change almost instantly. The room itself remained elegant and composed, yet beneath the surface a different emotion appeared to take hold. Conversations slowed, expressions shifted. Individuals who moments earlier had been focused on social pleasantries suddenly seemed aware that something unusual had occurred. But why would a single moment trigger such a reaction? The answer may lie in the extraordinary importance attached to royal symbols. Throughout British history, objects connected to the crown have often represented far more than their physical form. They become embodiments of continuity, authority, and memory. To supporters of the monarchy, protecting those symbols is inseparable from protecting the institution itself. To others, debates surrounding those symbols reveal deeper struggles over influence and legitimacy within the modern royal household. This is precisely why the incident attracted so much attention. As discussions spread among commentators and palace observers, a larger question emerged. Was this simply a misunderstanding amplified by speculation, or was it evidence of an unresolved tension between competing visions of the monarchy's future? Some believe the episode reflected a natural adjustment period following Queen Elizabeth II's passing. Others argued it highlighted an ongoing effort to define who would ultimately shape the legacy of the new reign. The timing only intensified the intrigue. In recent years, the royal family has faced unprecedented scrutiny from multiple directions. The continuing public interest surrounding Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, has reinforced conversations about the monarchy's next generation. Meanwhile, ongoing debates involving Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, have kept questions of loyalty and institutional identity firmly in the public spotlight. Against that backdrop, even seemingly small incidents can acquire outsized significance. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the story is not the event itself, but the reactions that followed. Royal watchers quickly noticed that different figures appeared to interpret the moment in dramatically different ways. Some viewed it as inconsequential. Others saw it as a challenge to long-established boundaries. Still others began asking whether the incident revealed tensions that had existed beneath the surface for far longer than anyone realized. And if those tensions were already present, what might happen when they collide with questions of succession, influence, and historical memory? That possibility transformed a brief moment into something far more compelling. Because once the conversation shifted from protocol to power, observers were no longer discussing a single event. They were discussing the future direction of the monarchy itself. And as more details began to emerge from inside royal circles, it became increasingly clear that this story was only beginning. The real significance of what happened would not be found in the initial reaction, but in the chain of consequences that followed. And those consequences would soon place several senior members of the royal family in an increasingly difficult position. The consequences of the incident did not unfold through public statements or dramatic announcements. Instead, they emerged through something far more revealing within royal institutions: silence. In the days that followed, palace observers began noticing subtle changes in behavior, shifts so understated that they might have escaped attention entirely had the atmosphere not already been charged with speculation. Yet among those who closely follow the royal family, even silence can become a form of communication. What made the situation increasingly significant was the growing perception that this was no longer simply about one controversial moment. The discussion had evolved into a broader examination of authority inside the monarchy itself. For decades, the late Queen's reign had been defined by a carefully maintained balance between personal relationships and institutional responsibilities. Now, some commentators began asking whether that balance was being tested in ways the public rarely witnessed. At the center of these conversations stood King Charles III. The monarch occupied an unusually delicate position. As sovereign, he carries the responsibility of protecting the institution's stability, yet as husband, brother, and father, he also navigates relationships that inevitably shape the dynamics of royal life. Throughout modern royal history, one recurring challenge has been separating personal loyalty from institutional duty. Whenever those two forces appear to collide, even briefly, public interest intensifies. And that is precisely what appeared to be happening. Observers noted that discussions surrounding the incident quickly divided into competing interpretations. One camp viewed the controversy as evidence of resistance to change, arguing that every new reign must eventually establish its own identity rather than remaining permanently tied to the previous monarch's era. Another group saw something entirely different. They believed the dispute reflected concerns about preserving traditions that many regard as essential to the monarchy's legitimacy. Neither interpretation fully explained what happened next. As the tension intensified, royal commentators began revisiting Princess Anne's unique position within the institution. Unlike many senior royals whose public roles are closely tied to future succession, Anne's influence has often come from something less visible but equally powerful: credibility. Over decades of service, she cultivated a reputation for placing duty ahead of popularity, a quality that has earned respect even among those who disagree with the monarchy itself. That reputation suddenly became an important factor. If the Princess Royal had chosen to distance herself from a situation, some observers reasoned, perhaps she was responding to something larger than a simple disagreement. But what exactly might that larger issue be? Was it about protocol? Was it about preserving Queen Elizabeth II's legacy? Or was it connected to a deeper struggle over how the institution should evolve during Charles's reign? Those questions only multiplied as royal insiders and commentators offered differing assessments. Some suggested that the incident highlighted an often overlooked reality about royal transitions. While the public tends to focus on titles and ceremonies, transitions also involve a gradual transfer of influence within the royal household. New advisors emerge, priorities shift, and relationships that were once stable can be redefined. In that environment, symbolic gestures sometimes carry extraordinary significance because they are interpreted as signals of broader intentions. If that assessment was correct, then the controversy may have represented only the visible surface of a much larger process. Adding further intrigue was the fact that public discussion increasingly centered on legacy rather than personalities. The debate was no longer solely about individual actions. Instead, people began asking who ultimately serves as guardian of the institution's traditions. Is that responsibility held exclusively by the sovereign? Does it belong collectively to senior members of the royal family? Or can figures such as an exert influence precisely because they are viewed as protectors of continuity rather than agents of change? These questions have no simple answers, which is one reason they captured so much attention. Meanwhile, another layer of the story quietly emerged. Some royal historians pointed out that moments of internal tension often become most visible during periods of transition. The reigns of British monarchs have repeatedly experienced phases in which competing visions of the future coexist uneasily. Those disagreements rarely appear in official documents, yet they sometimes reveal themselves through symbolic disputes that seem minor until viewed in a larger historical context. Could this be one of those moments? The possibility became increasingly difficult to dismiss as the conversation spread beyond palace watchers and into broader public debate. Supporters of different royal figures began interpreting the situation through their own perspectives, while commentators examined what it might reveal about the monarchy's direction during the coming decade. The involvement of respected senior figures transformed the story from a temporary controversy into a discussion about institutional identity. Yet perhaps the most intriguing development was the growing realization that key participants remained publicly restrained. There were no explosive interviews, no direct accusations, and no official attempts to settle the matter through public confrontation. That restraint suggested that significant conversations might be taking place behind closed doors, beyond the view of cameras and commentators. And if private discussions were indeed underway, what conclusions were being reached? Because by this stage, the central issue had expanded far beyond the original incident. Questions about influence, authority, loyalty, and the preservation of royal tradition were beginning to intersect in ways that few had anticipated. What initially appeared to be a dispute over symbolism was increasingly being viewed as a test of how power is exercised within the modern monarchy. And as palace insiders reportedly continued to assess the fallout, a new and potentially far more consequential question started to emerge, one that could affect not only current relationships inside the royal household, but also the future balance of influence within the reign itself. That question would soon push the story into even more sensitive territory. Yet the deeper palace observers looked into the controversy, the more they encountered a paradox. If this had truly been a simple disagreement over protocol, why had the discussion continued to expand long after the original incident faded from public view? And if it was merely symbolic, why did so many experienced royal commentators seem convinced that something more significant was unfolding beneath the surface? Part of the answer may lie in the unique role princess and has occupied throughout her life. Unlike figures whose influence rises and falls with public popularity, the princess royal has often been viewed as a stabilizing force within the institution itself. Her authority has never depended upon future succession, media campaigns, or personal branding. Instead, it has come from an almost relentless dedication to continuity. That distinction matters because continuity is not simply a ceremonial concept within the monarchy. It is one of the foundations upon which royal legitimacy rests. For that reason, some historians began drawing comparisons to earlier periods of royal transition, moments when the monarchy faced questions about how much should change and how much should remain untouched. Those historical parallels did not suggest identical circumstances, but they highlighted a recurring pattern. Whenever one era ends and another begins, debates inevitably emerge over who becomes the guardian of institutional memory. And that may explain why reactions to the controversy appeared so emotionally charged. What many viewers initially interpreted as a dispute involving personalities increasingly resembled a disagreement about stewardship. In royal circles, stewardship carries enormous significance because symbols are rarely viewed as isolated objects. They represent connections between generations, linking past sovereigns to present responsibilities and future expectations. Once the discussion shifted into that territory, the controversy ceased to be about a single event and became part of a much broader conversation about identity. Yet another development complicated matters further. Several commentators observe that different generations within the royal family appear to embody different priorities. King Charles III inherited an institution facing pressures unlike those experienced by his predecessors. Public scrutiny operates at unprecedented speed, social media accelerates narratives within hours, and every gesture is examined through countless competing interpretations. Managing a modern monarchy requires balancing tradition with adaptation, a task that often creates tensions invisible to the public. Could this balancing act be contributing to the situation? Some analysts believe it might. They argue that every modern royal household contains competing pressures. On one side lies the need to preserve continuity, reassuring supporters that the institution remains grounded in its historic foundations. On the other side lies the need to demonstrate relevance, proving that the monarchy can evolve alongside society. Those objectives are not necessarily contradictory, but they can create friction when different individuals emphasize different priorities. What makes the current story particularly intriguing is that it appears to touch directly upon that fault line. Meanwhile, attention increasingly shifted toward the broader structure of influence surrounding the monarch. Contrary to popular imagination, royal institutions are shaped not only by senior family members, but also by networks of advisors, private secretaries, long-serving staff, and trusted confidants. These individuals rarely attract headlines, yet they play an important role in preserving institutional culture. When controversies arise, their perspectives often carry considerable weight behind closed doors. That realization led some royal watchers to ask an uncomfortable question. If concerns truly existed regarding the preservation of certain traditions, how widespread were those concerns? Were they confined to a small number of individuals, or do they reflect broader sentiments among those responsible for maintaining the monarchy's internal framework? No definitive answer emerged, but the question itself became significant. At the same time, the public fascination surrounding the story revealed something else. Many people were not merely reacting to the reported incident. They were projecting larger anxieties onto it. For supporters of continuity, the episode seemed to symbolize fears about losing connections to an era represented by Queen Elizabeth II. For others, it highlighted uncertainty surrounding how the institution would define itself during the decades ahead. This helps explain why discussions repeatedly return to legacy. Legacy within royal life is not limited to historical achievements. It also concerns perception. Future generations often remember monarchs, not only for what they accomplished, but for how effectively they preserved the institution for those who followed. Viewed through that lens, debates over symbolism become far more consequential than they initially appear. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation was the absence of a clear resolution. Normally, controversies fade when a convincing explanation emerges. In this case, however, competing interpretations continued to coexist. Every answer seemed to generate additional questions. Was the incident an isolated misunderstanding, a reflection of broader institutional tensions, a warning sign of deeper disagreements about the monarchy's direction? Each possibility pointed toward a different conclusion, yet none fully accounted for the growing sense that larger forces were at work. Then another possibility began attracting attention. Some royal historians suggested that moments like these often become important only in retrospect. At the time they occur, they seem relatively minor. Years later, however, they are viewed as early indicators of shifts that were already underway. In other words, the real significance may not lie in the controversy itself, but in what it reveals about evolving relationships, changing priorities, and emerging centers of influence within the royal household. If that interpretation is correct, then the story may not be about the past at all. It may be about the future, because as observers continued examining the implications, a more consequential question quietly emerged. What if the incident was not the cause of growing tensions, but merely the first visible sign of pressures that had been building behind palace walls for much longer than anyone realized? And if those pressures were finally beginning to surface, the developments that followed could reshape the entire way the story is understood. That possibility would become impossible to ignore as attention turned toward the individuals expected to guide the monarchy into its next chapter. As attention continued to grow, the discussion entered a far more consequential phase. No longer confined to questions of symbolism or protocol, the controversy began intersecting with a subject that royal institutions take extraordinarily seriously: confidence. Monarchies ultimately rely not only on constitutional arrangements, but also on public confidence in the judgment, unity, and stability of those entrusted with representing the crown. Once observers started viewing the situation through that lens, the stakes increased dramatically. The challenge facing the royal household was not necessarily the reported event itself, but the perception of what it represented. Perception has always played a decisive role in royal history. Throughout generations, moments that appeared relatively minor in isolation often became defining narratives because they seemed to confirm broader concerns already circulating among the public. In this case, commentators increasingly noted that the controversy appeared to touch several sensitive themes simultaneously: legacy, authority, loyalty, and the future direction of the monarchy. That convergence made the story difficult to dismiss. What complicated matters, further, was the changing position of the institution itself. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, the monarchy benefited from a level of continuity that lasted for decades. The public became accustomed to a remarkably stable royal framework, one in which traditions felt permanent and leadership appeared predictable. The transition to a new reign inevitably altered that environment. Even supporters who welcomed change often found themselves comparing present developments with memories of the previous era. Could any successor realistically avoid such comparisons? For King Charles III, that question carried particular significance. Every sovereign inherits not only a throne but also expectations created by those who came before. In Charles's case, those expectations are unusually substantial because they are measured against one of the longest and most respected reigns in modern British history. As a result, decisions that might otherwise attract limited attention are often interpreted as indicators of how the new reign intends to define itself. That reality may help explain why discussions surrounding the controversy continue to resonate. At the same time, another factor quietly entered the conversation. Analysts began focusing less on individual personalities and more on institutional resilience. Royal households are designed to withstand periods of uncertainty, but they do so by maintaining internal cohesion. Whenever observers perceive divisions among senior figures, questions naturally arise about whether that cohesion remains intact. Such concerns do not require open conflict to gain traction. Sometimes the mere appearance of differing priorities is enough to generate speculation. This is where the role of senior royals becomes particularly important. Figures such as the Princess Royal have long served as symbols of continuity precisely because they remain closely associated with established traditions. Meanwhile, other members of the family are often tasked with helping the institution adapt to changing expectations. Neither role is inherently opposed to the other, yet balancing those responsibilities requires careful coordination. When that balance appears strained, even briefly, public attention intensifies. Meanwhile, commentators increasingly turn their focus toward the next generation. The growing prominence of Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, has transformed discussions about the monarchy's future. As the eventual future king and queen, their actions are frequently viewed through a long-term lens. Royal watchers began asking whether the current controversy might influence broader conversations about succession, institutional priorities, and the image the monarchy wishes to project in the decades ahead. That question opened an entirely new dimension of the story. If the institution is preparing for the future while simultaneously preserving its connection to the past, then disputes involving legacy become especially significant. They are no longer viewed as isolated disagreements. Instead, they become part of a larger debate about how continuity and modernization can coexist. The challenge is not choosing one over the other, but determining where the balance should be placed. And balance, historically, has often been one of the monarchy's greatest tests. Several historians pointed out that royal institutions rarely face their most serious challenges during moments of obvious crisis. More often, pressure accumulates gradually through a series of smaller developments that reveal underlying tensions. Viewed individually, each event appears manageable. Viewed collectively, they begin to suggest deeper structural questions. Was the current controversy one of those moments? No one could say with certainty, but the possibility increasingly occupied the attention of commentators. What made the situation even more intriguing was the absence of a definitive narrative. Different groups continued interpreting the events through entirely different frameworks. Some saw a conflict between tradition and adaptation. Others viewed it as a question of institutional stewardship. Still others believed the Real story involved the complexities of navigating a royal transition in an era of relentless public scrutiny. Each interpretation contained elements of plausibility, yet none fully explained why the discussion refused to fade. Perhaps that persistence was itself revealing. The longer the conversation continued, the more it suggested that people were responding to something larger than a single reported incident. They were responding to uncertainty. Uncertainty about how the monarchy would evolve. Uncertainty about which figures would shape its future identity. Uncertainty about how the legacy of one historic reign would coexist with the realities of another. And it was precisely at that point that the story reached its most critical stage. Because the central question was no longer whether a controversy had occurred. The real question was what the controversy revealed. As palace observers, historians, and royal commentators continued examining the implications, attention increasingly shifted toward a final and unavoidable issue: whether this episode would ultimately be remembered as a temporary disagreement or as an early warning sign of a much larger transformation already taking place behind palace walls. The answer to that question may completely reshape how the entire story is understood. But perhaps the most important realization to emerge from this entire story is that controversies involving royal institutions are rarely remembered because of a single moment. They endure because they reveal something deeper about the period in which they occur. Long after the immediate headlines disappear, historians and royal observers often return to these episodes not to examine the event itself, but to understand what it revealed about the monarchy at a particular crossroads in its evolution. Viewed through that lens, the significance of the story becomes much clearer. The discussion was never really about a chair, a gesture, or even a disagreement over protocol. Instead, it reflected a larger question confronting the royal family as it moves further into a new era. Every monarchy depends upon a delicate balance between continuity and change. Lean too heavily toward preserving the past, and the institution risks appearing disconnected from modern realities. Move too aggressively toward transformation, and it risks weakening the traditions that provide its sense of legitimacy and identity. That challenge is not unique to the current reign, but it may be especially visible now. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II represented a remarkably stable presence whose authority transcended generations. Her reign created a sense of continuity that became deeply embedded in public consciousness. Following such an extraordinary period, any successor would inevitably inherit not only constitutional responsibilities, but also the enormous task of defining what comes next. The transition was never going to be measured solely through official duties and state ceremonies. It would also be judged through symbols, perceptions, and the public's confidence in the institution's ability to navigate change. This is why royal observers continue paying attention. Behind discussions about individual figures lies a broader conversation about stewardship, who will shape the monarchy's identity in the years ahead. Which values will be emphasized as the institution adapts to new challenges? How should the balance be struck between preserving the legacy of the past and preparing for the future? Those questions extend far beyond any single controversy. They also help explain why figures such as Princess and continue to attract such respect among many royal commentators. Her reputation has been built not on future ambition or public image management, but on consistency. Whether one agrees with her views or not, she is often perceived as someone who represents continuity with an earlier era of royal service. In periods of transition, individuals who embody stability frequently become symbols in their own right. At the same time, the monarchy cannot function solely by looking backward. The institution's future will eventually be shaped by the next generation, particularly Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Their growing prominence reflects the reality that every royal transition is also preparing the ground for another one. Decisions made today are often evaluated not only for their immediate impact, but for how they position the monarchy decades into the future. That creates a fascinating dynamic. The current reign exists at the intersection of several different timelines. One timeline is focused on preserving the legacy of the past. Another is centered on managing the realities of the present. A third is already looking toward the future reign of the Prince of Wales. When those timelines overlap, tensions can emerge even when everyone involved ultimately shares the same goal of protecting the institution. Perhaps that is why stories like this resonate so strongly with audiences. People recognize that they are witnessing more than isolated events. They are watching an institution adapt in real time. The monarchy has survived for centuries precisely because it has repeatedly found ways to navigate periods of uncertainty while maintaining a sense of continuity. Yet each generation faces its own tests, and each transition leaves behind clues about the direction in which the institution is moving. What makes the current moment particularly intriguing is that the final verdict has not yet been written. Years from now, this episode may be remembered as little more than a temporary controversy that generated outsized attention. Alternatively, it may be viewed as an early indication of broader shifts already underway within the royal household. The truth will likely depend on developments that have yet to unfold. History often assigns significance retrospectively, connecting dots that seem unrelated in the moment. And that brings us back to the central theme running through this entire story. The debate was never simply about personalities. It was about legacy. It was about stewardship. It was about how institutions preserve their identity while navigating inevitable change. Whether one views the reported events as symbolic, consequential, or somewhere in between, they have sparked a conversation that reaches far beyond any individual royal figure. In many ways, that conversation may prove to be the most important part of the story. Because the real question is not what happened on a particular day inside palace walls. The real question is what these discussions reveal about the monarchy's future, the expectations placed upon its leaders, and the ongoing effort to balance history with modernity in an increasingly complex world. As royal watchers continue to debate the meaning of these events, one possibility remains impossible to ignore. Perhaps the story was never about a dispute at all. Perhaps it was about a monarchy standing at a historic turning point, revealing the challenges that accompany every new chapter while reminding the world that legacy is not inherited automatically. It must be carefully protected, interpreted, and passed forward. What do you think? Was this simply another moment of royal controversy amplified by public attention, or does it point to something larger taking place behind the scenes as the monarchy continues its transition into a new era? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video. Because sometimes the most revealing royal stories are not the ones that answer every question, but the ones that leave us wondering what comes next.